The Nile, the world's longest river. A 7,000-kilometer lifeline for almost 400 million people. Flowing north, the Nile runs through 10 countries, from the highlands in the heart of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A source of sustenance, but also one of tension, even potential conflict. For centuries, Egypt has sought to be master of the Nile, seeking to tame the river's unpredictable flow and to ensure exclusive control over its use. But today, countries upstream are challenging this dominance and are pushing for a greater say and a greater share of the River Nile. The Aswan High Dam, man's greatest ever effort to control the Nile. It halted the annual flood and stored a huge supply of water for Egypt behind its Great Wall. The dam was hailed as a triumph of engineering and water management, but there was a price to be paid.
Prior to the construction of the High Dam, the River Nile used to bring 4 million tons of fertile silt each year that would deposit on the land. It was like a natural fertilizer.
This silt, washed from the Ethiopian highlands, was no longer carried into Egypt. It now dropped uselessly to the bed of the man-made reservoir behind the dam. Deprived of the silt, Egyptian farmers today rely increasingly on artificial fertilizers.
My grandfather and my father used to need only 1 sack of chemical fertilizer for an acre of land. Nowadays, each acre needs at least 7 sacks.
The loss of natural fertility in Egypt's farmland was not the only negative repercussion of the Aswan High Dam. The reservoir formed by the accumulation of waters behind the dam was named Lake Nasser. Today, it's one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, stretching over 500 kilometers. It straddles the borders of Egypt and Sudan, an area known as Nubia. Situated on the banks of the River Nile, Nubia was home to many ancient temples. But in the 1960s, during the construction of the Aswan High Dam, the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to submerge these monuments. The United Nations spearheaded an international rescue campaign. More than 20 temples were dismantled, stone by stone, and relocated to higher ground. The largest of these were the 2 giant temples of Abu Simbel, built by the pharaoh Ramses II. In their new location, the temples remain a major tourist attraction in Egypt to this day. Archaeological sites were saved, but people living in the area received no such consideration. The Nubians, an ethnic group originating in southern Egypt and northern Sudan, have lived beside the Nile for thousands of years.
All Nubians live on the banks of the Nile. The Nile is our life, like fish. We would die if we left it.
This attachment to the river has proved a blessing, but also a curse. During construction of the Aswan Low Dam in 1899, the Nubians were forced to move. They were relocated here, on the west bank of the Nile, in Aswan. Today, the village of Khab Suhail is the most famous Nubian settlement, a place where tourists come seeking a glimpse of a traditional life.
I grew up and worked with my uncle who taught me about sailing. I worked with him in tourism, and now I have managed to buy my own small boat.
The Nubian community here has found a new way to make a living from the Nile. But a second major displacement of Nubians was to prove far more traumatic. In May 1964, Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev attended celebrations, marking the start of the second stage of building the Aswan High Dam. At the push of a button, water levels behind the dam rose rapidly. The project was on track, but at the expense of over 120,000 Nubians in both Egypt and Sudan who were forced to move.
It was very difficult to be pulled out of our homeland and taken to another place. It was very harsh. The displacement my family suffered in the Nubian region was very painful. It was a huge sacrifice.
They left everything behind. Many people died, among them many children. No one was given any time to do anything. Our people had to leave everything in a rush to catch the boat.
A civilization dating back thousands of years was uprooted. The Nubians called their homeland the land of gold. But it was now gone forever, for just a meager sum of money.
My father received 36 Egyptian pounds in compensation for the house, the land, and everything else.
The Egyptian and Sudanese governments had promised the Nubians better living conditions. But their new home, away from the Nile, proved far from satisfactory.
They moved us into concrete buildings and at a stroke took away our history and civilization. They wiped out our identity. They took us away from the Nile. Nubians are only happy when they are beside the Nile, but not a single resettlement village was by the river.
Arif Jamal is a Sudanese Nubian. He was a child when the displacement occurred. Today, he teaches African history in America.
After 50 years, when you look at the new land that was acquired by the Nubians, or where the Nubians were displaced to, is a miserable reading, where you have an enormous amount of health problems, you have very bad logistics, and again, massive migration, but this time they look like refugees.
Despite the trauma of displacement, Nubians have done their best to keep alive their traditions and their distinctive language. Many Nubian songs center on a return to their lost homeland. Their dances inspired by the gentle flow of the Nile.
You can never forget your homeland, the place where you are born and the place where you die. We live now in our memories.
There is still a large Nubian community in northern Sudan, which remains on the land of its forefathers on the banks of the Nile. But even they are now under threat. In 1992, the Sudanese government announced its intention to build a huge hydropower station here in Nubia. The planned project, known as the Jazeera Dam, would use the Nile flow to boost Sudan's power supply. Once again, the Nubians face being sacrificed on the altar of development.
There is no social or environmental assessment to it. The communities are against it. We are talking about 99 villages along the Nile. We are talking about 1.5 million people. We are talking about 1 million acres of fertile land. We are talking about the last prestigious date palms that people live on. We are talking about archaeology that we did not even scratch the surface of.
The Sudanese government put the project on hold, but for the Nubians, it remains an ever-present menace.
It's just like a nightmare or a threat. Every now and then we hear the president talking about reviving this project, which is Jazeera. If they build the Jazeera Dam, this will be the last of the wonderful Nubian land.
Environmental and human factors have made many international donors wary of providing loans for large hydrological schemes on the Nile. But the rise of a new power on the world stage has given new momentum to unconditional lending.
China built up its own hydropower industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And a few years ago, they appeared on the global scene with a bang. They started funding projects which had before not gone forward because nobody wanted to touch them.
The Marui Dam in northern Sudan is one such project. It was officially opened in 2009 by Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir amid great celebration. The dam was seen as the solution to the country's shortage of power. Its huge turbines using the river flow to generate electricity. But the Sudanese had initially found it difficult to get the project off the ground.
The Sudanese government had tried to attract funding from European governments, from Canada, from other sources for many years, and they didn't succeed because of environmental concerns and human rights concerns.
In 2003, Chinese and Sudanese officials put pen to paper on an agreement in which China would provide a substantial loan for the building of the Marui Dam. But during the construction, clashes erupted when the Sudanese army moved in to evict locals from villages that were to be submerged by the dam's reservoir. This was exactly the sort of humanitarian suffering which had influenced many creditors to shy away from financing the dam. In the end, the protests came to nothing. the project went ahead. As the waters rose behind the dam, some 50,000 Sudanese had to leave their homes and much of their property.
I lost everything. I had over 100 palm trees. Is the government going to compensate us? If not, then our only compensation is from Allah.
Africa's large dams have not reversed poverty. They have not dramatically increased electricity rates. They have not dramatically improved water supply for people living there. What they have done is help create a small industrial economy that tends to be companies from Europe and elsewhere. And so these benefits are really, really concentrated in a very small elite.
The number of hydro power stations along the course of the River Nile is on the rise. With the exception of Egypt, the Nile Basin countries face a chronic shortage of power. Large majorities of the populations in these countries do not have access to electricity. Uganda is one such example. Here on the Nile, close to its outlet from Lake Victoria, there are 2 hydro power stations. But combined, they don't generate enough power for a country with a growing economy and an increasing population.
9% of our people have electricity. 91% don't. So we have an aggressive rural electrification program, which is ongoing, and we have a target that in the next 4 years, this number, which is today 9%, should rise to 16% in the list.
The Nile in Uganda is characterized by high-speed rapids and waterfalls. One of the most well-known is the Murchison. It's an area that attracts tourists from around the world. And it's home to Uganda's largest national park. The stretch of river here is ideal for those seeking the thrill of whitewater rafting. Toto Closer has been running rafting expeditions for tourists along the river since 1996. He has made a decent living, but these falls are now threatened by the construction of a new dam. Toto is torn between the love of his work and his country's need for electricity.
So for my comment about that dam, the electricity is good and rafting is good, so it's for them to know what is good, what is better between. I need electricity, but on the moment, I like rafting so much. I like rafting so much.
The Bujagali Dam, a new hydropower station being built here, will flood the rapids and create a man-made reservoir. But the dam will meet only a fraction of the country's electricity requirements. The Ugandan government is keen to exploit these fast-flowing waters to generate power. Another hydropower station is planned here, further downstream at the Karuma Falls. Another project that threatens the natural flow of the river.
If you force a lot of the dams, it means you're extracting more water, which the rivers cannot support. And as a result, the Lake Victoria's levels went down more than 2 meters.
Lake Victoria is the largest lake in Africa and one of the most renowned sources of the Nile. Yet, it is slowly and gradually shrinking. The increasing number of hydropower stations on the Nile in Uganda is drawing ever greater amounts of water out of the lake to move the turbines generating electricity.
About half of the recent drop in Lake Victoria, which has been pretty extreme, can be attributed to these dams. They're basically opened up, and now water can be let out at any pace that the government chooses to.
3 countries share the waters of Lake Victoria. This is the city of Kisumu, Kenya's main port on the lake and the hub of its fishing industry. For 25 years, Thomas Agutu has fished here. He remembers the days when fish were once plentiful and business was good. Nowadays, he's getting a much smaller catch.
We don't have enough fish in this lake because all the water is directed to the River Nile. Look at those rocks. A while back, you couldn't see them. But now, they show how much the water level has dropped. And as they build more hydropower stations, all the water and all the fish will go to Uganda and to the Nile.
The Egyptians are content that the water continues to flow on downstream. They accept their Nile partners building hydropower plants, but they are not prepared to allow upstream countries to build dams that will reduce the amount of water reaching Egypt.
We don't have hostile intentions against anyone. We don't go to war just for the sake of fighting. But if someone is going to stop the water, Egypt will die of thirst. Then we will fight with all means available.
As populations increase and economies develop, demand for the waters of the Nile is intensifying. The question remains, who owns the river's water? Perhaps the answer may lie in history. In a bygone era, when foreign rulers once controlled the full length of the great river.